In this video, I will walk you through configuring a polling group in the EFM Exporter to poll and export EFM flow data from a flow computer in TOPServer. This video covers the polling frequency and export of the EFM data from a range of supported flow computers using the TOPServer EFM Suite's drivers. Configuration of those drivers for the actual connection to the flow computers is covered in separate videos. Flow computers are commonly used in the oil and gas industry for electronic flow measurement of both gas and liquids through the various stages of collection, distribution, and transport of oil and gas. I will cover the configuration of the poll group for controlling poll frequency and timing, as well as adding meters and exporters for the supported analytical packages, including FlowCal and PGAS. So, here in my TOPServer, the first step in configuring the EFM exporter is to add a poll group. The poll group controls when EFM data is collected from the specified meters from configured flow computers and then exported to one of the configured supported exporters for FlowCal, PGAS, CSV, or database. So I just need to find the EFM exporter in my tree view in TOPServer. So you can see I have EFM exporter here. And then I just need to click the Add Poll Group link. Now, if you were to not see EFM Exporter in this tree view, you can go up here to the View menu and just make sure EFM Exporter is enabled with a check mark next to it. Now, if it isn't an option at all, even in the View menu, then the EFM Exporter wasn't installed, and you'll need to run an update to your TOPServer installation, and make sure to select the EFM Exporter from the installation options. My EFM exporter is available here, so I'm going to go ahead and click Add Poll Group, and that pops up my property editor for my EFM exporter for the poll group. Now, the name for the poll group is user configurable, and will be how the group appears in the TOPServer tree view. For demo purposes, I'm simply going to call my poll group Daily EFM. And the description field is just an optional field for providing additional summary information about what this poll group does or is for. We'll leave this field blank for the demo. Then we come to On-Demand Polling Only setting. Now, this allows you to control EFM polling for this group manually when it's enabled or set to yes by writing to a system tag for the poll group called poll when this setting's set to yes. Now, the default is no, which means that this poll group is going to be controlled by the remainder of the poll group settings that we define below this. So we're going to go ahead and maintain the default of no for this for demo purposes. Now we come to the poll rate. Now the poll rate defines the frequency of EFM polls for this group. Now it works in conjunction with the poll rate units, which defines whether the poll rate is in minutes, hours, or days, with the default being hours, as you can see. But you can see you can also set that to minutes or days depending on the poll frequency you need. And it also works with the base start time that you see here, which defaults to midnight. So the default poll rate is 1 hour. So, for example, with these defaults, our poll group will request EFM uploads from our meters every hour starting at midnight. So, that being said, a poll would occur at midnight. Assuming we configured this before midnight, then our first poll would be at midnight. And it would be at every hour after that. So, we'd have a poll at midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., so on and so forth, every hour of every day, essentially. Then we come to the poll on start setting, which controls whether the poll group should also do an initial EFM upload on startup. Meaning a poll will occur, if this is set to yes, a poll will occur when the server is restarted, when the server stopped and then started again, when a new project is loaded, or even when the EFM exporter properties are edited. But we're going to go ahead and maintain the default of no for this one, which means we're only going to poll based off of this poll rate and base start time. And last but not least for the poll group is the enabled setting. The poll group will only poll your flow devices when enabled, so the default setting, which we'll keep here, is yes. And then we're going to go ahead and click OK to apply these changes and finish our poll group. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward to configure the poll group. Now that our poll group's complete, we need to add a meter to the poll group. Now we need to tell the poll group which meters to poll at the allotted frequencies that we defined. So every hour starting at midnight, in other words, of every day. Now, this can be any combination of meters across multiple flow computers if desired. Now, I have an ABB total flow channel device configured that contains one gas meter and one liquid meter for the purposes of this demo. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start configuring this. I'm going to add each of those meters to my new pole group. So I'm going to start with the gas meter. If I right-click on this gas meters group here under my pole group, I can select either new meter or add multiple meters. So new meter is useful for adding just a single meter, or add multiple meters allows me to launch a meter browser, and then multi-select meters for ease of use, which is nice when you need to add a lot of meters to the same pole group. So for this demo, I'm going to go ahead and select new meter since I only have one gas meter configured. Now for the meter designations you see here, I can click this ellipsis button here to the right to browse my available meters in the TOPServer configuration. So you'll see there's my ABB channel with my total flow device, and you'll see I have one gas meter, and it's appropriately enough it's named gas meter. So I'm going to go ahead and select gas meter and click apply. And as you can see, the format for the meter here is channel name dot device name dot meter name, just for future reference. Next, we have several settings that control what actual gas EFM data will be requested from the meters. The Efm General Settings specify whether or not EFM alarms and EFM events should be retrieved for the meter. The device configuration itself determines what is defined as an alarm and what is defined as an event in your device. The default is collecting both alarms and events, so we're going to go ahead and maintain those defaults. Then we come to the Efm History Settings, and these specify whether or not EFM hourly and EFM daily records should be retrieved from the meter. The device configuration determines, again, what EFM data is in a record based on the enabled options. Now, the default is collecting both hourly and daily EFM records, so we're going to go ahead and maintain those defaults. And last for the meter setup is the enabled setting. Disabling this results in this particular meter not being polled at the next polling interval. The default is enabled. We're going to go ahead and keep that default, and we're going to click OK to finish adding our gas meter. And next, we'll go ahead and add our liquid meter. So I'm going to right click again here, this time on the liquid meters. I'm going to select new meter again since I only have one of them. And again, I can browse my meters under my total flow device. Again, they're appropriately named. I have a liquid meter. I'm going to select that and click apply. Now when you're configuring on a liquid meters, you'll only see liquid meters, and when you're configuring under gas meters, you'll only see gas meters. So there's no way to confuse the two. So if you happen to be using similar naming, the only types of meters that are ever going to be displayed when you're configuring the liquid meters group are going to be liquid meters, and vice versa, gas meters if you're configuring under gas meters. So you don't have to worry about getting those mixed up at all. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply to select my liquid meter. And you'll notice, again, these settings, these other settings, both our EFM General and our EFM History settings, look very similar to our gas meter. We're going to keep the defaults here for alarms and events. We're going to keep the defaults for hourly and daily. And you'll notice there's an additional option for batch EFM history, which is only available with liquid meters. But you'll also notice it's grayed out right now. And that's because the ABB Total Flow doesn't actually support batch history. But some of the other drivers that we support for EFM collection do support batch, so that setting would be available for the particular drivers that do actually support retrieving that from your flow computers. So we're going to go ahead and keep all the defaults here. We're going to keep it enabled, of course, and click OK to finish configuring our EFM meters. And now that our meters are configured for the pole group, we can get to the heart of the EFM exporter setup and configure our actual exporters. So pole groups, just for your information, pole groups are not limited to a single exporter. So the same EFM data can be stored in multiple ways without requiring additional EFM poles in order to do that. It's just a matter of defining the additional types of exporter for each pole group in order to make that happen. Now, you'll see we have this group of gas meters, and liquid meters, and there's an exporters folder under each of those. That's because exporters are added to liquid and gas meter groups separately. So we just need to right click on the appropriate meter group and specify what type of exporter should be used. Since the configurations are essentially identical, or close enough such that it would be duplication of information to go through both in sequence, I'm just going to be configuring one of each exporter type for a gas meter. And I will mention when an exporter is also compatible with liquid meters, just so you're aware of that. Now, if I right-click on the exporters group under my gas meters, I can define either FlowCal exporter, FlowCal transaction queue exporter, a CSV exporter, PGAS exporter, or database exporter. So I'm just going to start at the top of the list and work my way down. I'll start with a FlowCal exporter, and that's going to export my EFM data to a CFX format file. FlowCal is compatible with both gas and liquid meters, with slightly different options in the settings being available that are going to be readily apparent if you're using a liquid versus a gas meter. Now, the name is just a user-defined name. That is how the exporter will appear in the EFM exporter configuration. So we're just going to call this FlowCal hourly. So I'm just going to tack an hourly on the end of that for demo purposes. Now, description's optional for providing more details about the exporter. We're just going to go ahead and leave that blank here. Then we get to the history type. Now, for gas meters, history type has 4 available options here. The type 1, which is gas basic, that's going to export basic flow information for meters without online chromatographs. For example, gas volume percentages. This is the default, and it's what we're going to use here, but I'll show you what the other options are as well. And you've got type 2, which is for gas, NX19, G1, and G2 exports. This exports data for NX19, Gross 1, and Gross 2 calculation methods, which are AGA and industry standard methods for calculating flow. This type should be chosen where those calculations have been implemented on your flow meter. So you'll need to check with to confirm if those calculations are implemented on your flow meter if you want to use type 2 for your history type. Then we have type 3, gas analysis, which exports data for analysis values using AGA 8 detail calculations, and should be chosen again where those particular AGA 8 detail calculations have been implemented on your particular flow meter. And last but not least, we come to type 4, which is gas exotic. This exports data for exotic analysis values that are not typically used or available. Selection of this setting ultimately depends again on what your flow computer is measuring and what it's configured for. And again, like I said, we'll keep the default of type 1 gas basic. And next we need to define the CFX file version. Now, this is pretty simple. For gas meters, it's going to be version 5. As you'll see, that's the only option that's available here, so we can't actually change it. And for liquids, if we were doing a liquid meter, this would be version 7, and we wouldn't be able to change it from version 7. Since we're, like I said, since we're defining this exporter for gas meters, version 5 is the only option. Now, then we come to the history interval. I'll select this so you can see we have 2 different options, either hourly or daily. With the default being hourly, which is what we're going to maintain here. Now, if you need both hourly and daily, you can configure an additional FlowCal exporter for your poll group, one for hourly and one for daily. That's the way to get both hourly and daily if you need those. Now, the next 3 settings, you'll see file path, open export path, and file name. These next 3 settings pertain to the actual file naming and actual storage location of the CFX files to be exported. So for file path, pretty self-explanatory. The default directory is the user's documents folder, but you can specify any directory that allows write access for the TOPServer runtime. And if the folder doesn't happen to already exist, it will be created for you once you apply these settings. And the open export path option here is just an easy way to open the specified directory in the file path field by clicking the open link. Then we come to the file name, and this is just the file name to be used for the CFX file. It'll be whatever specified here, .cfx. You'll see here is actually a wildcard. Both the file path and the file name support wildcards. This one being meter name. So this will result in my CFX files being called gasmeter.cfx because that's my meter name. So that's the wildcard. A full listing of the wildcards available, and the wildcards are available specific to both records or at a overall server level. So a full listing of wildcards is available in the Efm Exporter plugin help file, and so if you open that help file under Exporters in the wildcards section, it'll show you all of the valid wildcards that you can use in your file path and your file name. And again, the enabled settings, pretty self-explanatory. Setting this to no results in no exports being performed for this exporter. We're going to maintain the default of enabled, and we're going to go ahead and click OK to complete the FlowCal exporter setup. And upon doing so, you'll notice down here in my event log, there's an indication for the first scheduled poll now that we've have a completed exporter. So daily EFM, which is my poll group. It's first poll scheduled for 5 p.m. today's date, which is basically the next hour increment. So it would start at 5 p.m. Then there'd be another one at 6 p.m., another one at 7 p.m., so on and so forth. So next, that's a FlowCal exporter. The next, we're going to go ahead and take a look at a FlowCal transaction queue exporter, which is compatible with only with gas meters. So if I right-click here and select New FlowCal transaction queue exporter, you'll notice there aren't a ton of settings here. The name is the usual descriptive entry. I'm just going to keep the default here of gas flow FlowCal TXQ or transaction queue. Again, the description is optional. We're going to leave that blank here. We're going to keep the exporter enabled. The history interval, again, we have option for hourly or daily. And we're going to keep the default of hourly. If you needed both, you configure one for each of those. Then we have the actual data source information. With FlowCal Transaction Queue, it's different than just a regular FlowCal CFX. The data is essentially exported to a custom FlowCal Oracle database. So you'll need to contact your system administrator for FlowCal to determine either the proper pre-existing data source or DSN on your system for accessing that FlowCal Transaction Queue database, or to find out from them the proper parameters for creating a new DSN that you can select from your system's DSNs. And the username and the password fields here correspond to the FlowCal Transaction Queue DSN and should be available from your system administrator as well. Now, I don't actually currently have access to a FlowCal Transaction Queue database, so rather than proceed with this, I'm going to go ahead and actually click Cancel on this one. You get the idea of what's necessary to configure that. So next, I'm going to right-click again, and I want to add a new CSV exporter to export to a CSV file, or comma-separated variables file. Now, this particular exporter is compatible with both gas and liquid meters. Now, I'm going to keep proceeding here. I'm going to go ahead and keep the default name, which is just gas CSV, and I'm going to keep the description blank. And again, we want to keep the exporter enabled. Now, that brings us to record time settings, and we have several options for what time to use in the format for that time. So, for the time basis setting, this defines whether the timestamps used should be based on, and I'll show you the options, it should be based on the time of the device itself, coordinated universal time or UTC, or the local system time where TOPServer is installed. The default is the device time, and that's what we're going to maintain here. The other time basis options, you can change to those at your discretion depending on your organization's specific use case and accounting requirements for the timestamps. So the time format setting defines the ordering of the components of the date and the time. So what order your month, day, year is in, what order your minutes, your hours, minutes, and seconds are in. This format is just a string. It can be reorganized in any combination necessary and delimited as necessary. So we're going to keep the default, which is the month, then a dash, then the day, then a dash, then the full year, 4-digit year, then a space, and then the hour, a colon, the minute, a colon, and then the second. And you can move that around. If you wanted to put the hour, minutes, and seconds first, you can do that. If you want to put the year ahead of the month and the day, you can do that. If you want to put the day, then the month, then the year, you can just swap those formatters around. As you can see, like the capital M's is month, capital D, double D is for day, capital year. You can do the 4 Y's for a full 4-digit year. And then lowercase h's for hours, lowercase m's for minutes, and lowercase s's for seconds. And again, you can swap those around as needed. You can use whatever delimiters you'd like for your particular use case in your CSV. Then we come to the encoding settings, which determine the formatting of the exported data. For character encoding, the default character encoding is UTF-8, as you can see, or you can also change that to ANSI. Which option you choose impacts the option required for the system that's consuming the output or opening it and viewing it at a later time. We're going to keep the default of UTF-8, and the default delimiter is a comma between fields, which is pretty standard for a CSV file given that it's a comma-separated variable file. Now, however, if you have a system that happens to be looking for a semicolon as the actual delimiter, you can select that option here in the delimiter setting. Now we're going to keep the default of comma, and we're going to click OK to finish the general options for our CSV exporter. So now that we finished those general settings, you can see that there are 4 new groups of settings for config, alarms, events, and history. 1 each for the data options we selected when we configured our gas meter earlier. These sections all contain the corresponding EFM configuration attributes that will be written to the CSV file. So if I select config, you'll see I've got all these EFM attributes mapped to a specific column name, and every single EFM attribute that's available has been pre-generated and assigned an appropriate column name along with the appropriate data type for that particular EFM attribute. And you can also if you double click on one of those, it opens its properties, and you can go in if you'd like those column names to be different. You can go in and you can tweak those. You can tweak the attributes. You can tweak the descriptions. You can tweak the data types. Just make sure you're setting those appropriately. It is recommended to leave those at the defaults unless you have a specific reason for coming in here and changing these. If for any reason, like if it pre-generates all of the available EFM attributes by default, if there are any of these that you don't want exported to your CSV file, it's easy enough. You can go in here, you can either right click on it and delete it, you can highlight it and click push your delete button to delete those, and any of these that are deleted out just won't be exported to the CSV file. They'll be filtered out because they're not listed here in your table. But they can be added back later if for some reason you ever decided that you needed to add those back, that you actually do need that information after all. You'll see it's the same thing with alarms, same thing with events, same thing with history. And you can also double click on these and open them up. You'll see for each of these you can also define the file path for where in the file names for where these are going to be exported to and what the files are going to be called. We're going to keep the defaults for these. Just be aware that the file path and the file name do still support those wildcards that I mentioned previously. And you can also enable or disable each of these individual groups as needed if you wanted to disable those and not have those get exported for some reason. Same thing with the alarms. File path and file names can be edited. You can enable or disable that. Events, exactly the same there. Now we get to the history group though. If I open this one up, you'll see it's slightly different. There are output options for both hourly output and daily output. So those are by default going to we're going to generate CSV files for both hourly and daily outputs. And so you have full control over defining the file paths and file names for those. Again, all the file paths and file name fields are compatible with the wildcards that are documented in the EFM Exporter plugin help file. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of here because we're going to keep the defaults for all of these. And we're finished with our CSV exporter. So moving on, I'm going to configure a PGAS exporter compatible with Quorum PGAS formats. And those are compatible only with gas meters, so they're not compatible with liquid meters. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a new PGAS exporter. And we're going to keep the default name of gas PGAS here. We're going to leave the description blank. And we have the same options for record time format. You can choose device time, UTC, or local system time. We're going to keep the device time as the default. We're going to keep the default file path and file name options here. Again, these support the wildcards. You can change those as desired, depending on how you want your file structure and naming to be, to make those easier to find. We're going to keep this exporter enabled. And then we get to our PGAS specific settings, these being for gas quality. So here, analytics are enabled by default, which results in a .ana file being exported with PGAS analytics data. Now, to disable this, you just set this setting to no if you don't need the analytics data to be exported. The history interval for gas quality can be set to either hourly, which is the default, daily, or both in this case. So for PGAS, you don't actually have to configure an additional PGAS exporter in order to get both hourly and daily, like you do with some of the other ones. So you can just set that to both if you need both. Otherwise, you can choose one or the other. We're going to keep hourly, which is the default. Then we come to our gas volume settings. And enable volume. Volume export is enabled by default, which results in a .vol file being exported with PGAS volume data. Again, similar to the gas quality analytics, you can disable this by setting this setting to no if you don't need that volume data to be exported. And exactly the same history interval options available for gas volume. We're going to keep the default of hourly, but you can set that to either daily or to both as needed. And we're going to go and click OK to complete our PGAS exporter. So you see that's pretty straightforward. And finally, we're going to go ahead and configure a new database exporter, which is compatible with both gas and liquid meters. So I'm going to right click here again on my exporters, select new database exporter. Again, we're going to keep the default name. We're going to keep gas database. We're going to leave the description blank again. Time basis options are exactly the same as the past couple times we've seen those. Device time, UTC, local system time. We're going to keep the default of device time. Then we have the Dsn properties corresponding to the database you'd like to export your EFM data. You can either select an already configured DSN for your desired database on the TOPServer machine, or configure a new DSN. If you have to configure a new DSN, it's recommended to configure the DSN as a system DSN. So you can see I can browse to my available DSNs on this particular machine. There's only one. This isn't one that I want to log EFM data to, but you can see this allows you to see the DSNs that are available on your local machine. Or you can click Configure DSN to launch the ODBC Data Source Administrator on this particular machine. I have mentioned you can do either a user DSN or a system DSN. Since TOPServer runs as a system service, I do recommend doing a system DSN wherever possible. So you would just go under your system DSN, click Add, and then you're going to go through. You'll select the right driver. So if it's an Access database, you'd select an Access driver. If it's a SQL database, you just select the appropriate SQL driver, and then you'll go on and you'll specify the specific machine where it's located, the login credentials, all of the other miscellaneous settings that you need for making a database connection. And if you're not sure what the proper DSN is to use or the settings for creating a new DSN, you will want to consult your organization's database administrator for assistance in determining those settings, and along with that, the proper username and password that you should be using for accessing that particular database. So I'm going to cancel out of this. You can go ahead and proceed with the other settings if you don't know your DSN and username and password information for the data source properties yet, which is what I'm going to do since I don't have a predefined database for for EFM export at this time. So we're going to go ahead and proceed. We come to the login timeout, and that is specified in seconds. It is recommended to keep the default of 5 seconds. This is how long TOPServer waits for a response from your database when connecting to the DSN before timing out. Now, if your DSN, if your particular database happens to be on a different machine, on a remote machine, and you know it takes it a little bit longer to respond because of that, you may want to increase this from 5 seconds. I don't typically recommend lowering this value, though. I would at the very least keep it at 5 seconds, just so you're not running into a timeout situation when we're trying to connect to your database for exporting your EFM data. And we're going to keep the exporter enabled here, and we're going to go ahead and click OK for the general settings. And we're going to scroll down here. Now, similar to the CSV exporter, as you saw earlier, you'll now notice some additional groups. We got a new group for config, alarms, events, hourly history, and daily history. If I highlight these, you'll see, as with the CSV exporter, we have pre-generated columns already mapped to each available EFM attribute. So all the EFM attributes that are available, and those do line up with exactly what the EFM attributes were that you saw previously when we did the CSV exporter. Those all are pre-generated with corresponding appropriate column name for those, along with the SQL data type that corresponds to the data that should be in that EFM attribute. Now, double-clicking each of these groups, again, like you could before, like we could with the CSV exporter, you can open those up. You can tweak the column names as needed. You can change the data types, the EFM attributes. If any of these are data that you don't want to be exported to your database, you can delete it. Right-click, delete, highlight it, hit the delete button. Again, same as previously. Now, additionally, and that's going to be the same for any of these groups, for alarms, events, hourly history, daily history. All of those are pre-generated. Now, additionally, double-clicking on each of these groups gives us the same settings. If I double-click on config, I've got some table selection settings here. This defaults to create and append, meaning that the table will be created by TOPServer, and then data will be appended to the end of any existing data in that table. The other option is to select existing table, and then in the table name, you'd specify a table that already exists in the database that you specified in your Dsn settings previously. For create and append, you can also change this table name if you desire it to be something other than the default, which for config is EFM gas config. So it's a pretty appropriate generic sounding table name, but you can change that as necessary. I'm going to keep the default. Here you can also enable or disable this particular grouping of data from being exported or not. We're going to keep that enabled. And like I said, if you go to alarms, you get the same types of settings for the table selection and to enable or disable. Events, same deal there. Hourly history, same deal there. And daily history, same deal there. Like I said, as you can see, the settings are the same across the other groups. It can be edited as necessary. We're keeping all of the defaults on those. We're going to keep all the EFM attributes in there and have those exported to our database. That's it for the our gas database EFM exporter. So now we've created an exporter for each type of export that TOPServer supports. That will export the same data from our gas meter in the poll group at the frequency specified. As I mentioned previously, information for configuring the underlying EFM-capable communications drivers included in the EFM suite for TOPServer is available in other videos. So this video has shown the general steps required for configuring the TOPServer EFM Exporter plugin in TOPServer version 6 for EFM data collection and export to Flowcal, PGAS, CSV, or databases. It's not intended to be a comprehensive how-to regarding the EFM Exporter or the EFM Suite drivers, and the corresponding plugin and driver help files should be referenced for further information.